Imagine the Mediterranean, not the sparkling blue sea we know today, but a vast, empty basin scorched by the sun. Let's rewind the clock 6 million years. Back then, the Mediterranean was a very different place. Tectonic forces deep within the Earth had pushed up a mountain range where the Strait of Gibraltar now lies, sealing the sea off from the Atlantic Ocean. With its lifeline cut, the Mediterranean had no way to refill itself. Day by day, under the relentless heat, the water began to disappear, evaporating into the sky. What was once a vibrant sea slowly turned into a barren wasteland. Only a few salty lakes remained, scattered across a desert of blinding white salt and layers of gypsum. Life, for the most part, vanished. Scientists call this event the Messinian Salinity Crisis, a dramatic moment at the end of the Miocene epoch when the Mediterranean almost died. It's a true story from Earth's ancient past, a reminder that even the greatest seas can vanish when nature shifts course. But imagine this. On a particular day around 5.3 million years ago, if you were walking along that dry, rocky mountain range where Gibraltar stands today, you might have noticed something strange. Just a small, quiet trickle of water, barely more than a stream, slipping down the slope from the distant Atlantic Ocean. Unbeknownst to you, the Earth had been slowly shifting again. Those mountains that once blocked the sea were gradually sinking, little by little, and on that day, they dipped just low enough for the ocean to peek over the edge. It began with a trickle, but that trickle was only the beginning of something massive. Once the ocean found its way over the edge, there was no turning back. That tiny trickle carved a path through the rock, gaining speed and power with every drop. The stream became a roaring river. And before long, it was as if the Atlantic itself came crashing through the gap. Water thundered down into the dry Mediterranean basin with unimaginable force. Some say it was like 1,000 Amazon rivers pouring in all at once. The sound, the power, the scale, utterly overwhelming. In a matter of months, maybe even days, the lifeless desert that had existed for over 600,000 years was drowned beneath rising waves. The sea had returned. The Mediterranean was reborn. The water rushed in with terrifying speed, about 32 meters per second, or 72 miles per hour, by the time it slammed into the coast of what we now call Sicily. It moved so fast that it dragged the air along with it, whipping up winds as strong as a tropical storm. This wasn't just a flood, it was a full-blown cataclysm. If you could somehow see through the chaos, past the swirling mud and debris stirred up by the deluge, you might have spotted a few unlucky fish, swept in from the Atlantic, dazed, or even killed outright by the sheer violence of the current. And just like that, the empty basin was no more. The Mediterranean Sea returned in a dramatic, world-changing flood. With it came the dawn of a new chapter in Earth's history, what scientists now call the Zanclean era. I don't think any human has ever seen anything like this, says Aaron McAuliffe, a National Geographic explorer and marine geoscientist at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. He's devoted years to studying the Zanclean megaflood, a cataclysmic event that reshaped the Mediterranean forever. Together with his team, McAuliffe has spent years piecing together this ancient mystery. They've combined hard geological evidence with cutting-edge computer models to reconstruct what the flood might have looked like. And while scientists are still uncovering clues, what they've found so far paints an extraordinary picture of what may be the largest flood in the history of planet Earth. McAuliffe and his colleagues discovered something remarkable. The Mediterranean Sea, which had already been wiped out once when it dried into a crusted wasteland, had been reshaped all over again, this time by the sheer power of the megaflood. The flood didn't just refill the basin, it carved new landscapes, gouged out deep scars in the seafloor, and redefined the very structure of the region. What had once been desolate was now deep and dynamic, a sea reborn through destruction. The fossil record doesn't give up its secrets easily, but scientists believe that before the Mediterranean dried up, it teemed with life. Ancient sharks, seals, fish of all shapes and sizes, and vibrant coral reefs once called these waters home. But when the salinity crisis struck, nearly everything vanished. Out of roughly 780 marine species that lived in the pre-crisis sea, only 86 made it through to the present day. Their survival, in the face of both desiccation and the fury of the megaflood, is nothing short of a miracle. How did they do it? Most likely, these survivors, a mix of mollusks, plankton, and even one remarkably resilient sea slug, found shelter in the few salty lakes that remained after the sea dried up. Tiny pockets of life, clinging on through a planetary catastrophe. As the floodgates opened, the Western Mediterranean filled with astonishing speed. According to Aaron McCullough, the water surged in at a rate between 68 and 100 million cubic meters every second, an almost unimaginable volume. With each passing day, the sea rose by as much as 10 meters, nearly 33 feet. But it wasn't just the water that shifted. The sheer weight of it pressed down on the Earth's crust like a colossal hand, forcing the ground to sink and slide across the hot, pliable mantle beneath. That movement, says Daniel Garcia Castellanos, a geophysicist from CSIC Barcelona and a leading expert on the Zanclean megaflood, likely set off powerful earthquakes, tremors that echoed across the region, reminders that even land is not immune to the fury of water. For the goat antelope creature, Myotragus, which had wandered across the parched seabed to settle on the islands of Mallorca and Menorca, the arrival of the flood must have felt like the end of the world. The earthquakes rattled the ground beneath their hooves, the rushing waters tore through the landscape, and the wind howled like the roar of some monstrous predator. This was a world-transforming event. A cataclysm that must have seemed like the final chapter for Myotragus and countless other creatures living on the island. As the waters surged higher, they eventually poured over the lip of Sicily, and as they moved eastward, the current began to carve through the land. The force was so powerful that it left behind long ridges, as though a giant hand had clawed through the earth. The landscape was reshaped by the flood in ways no one could have predicted. A little further east, the rising waters reached another obstacle, the Malta Escarpment. This natural barrier divided the Mediterranean into two halves, creating a giant bowl in the western part of the sea. For the water to continue its journey eastward, it first had to fill the western half of the Mediterranean completely, transforming the entire landscape in the process. Once the western half of the sea had filled enough to spill over the top of the Malta Escarpment, the water cascaded down into the eastern Mediterranean like a raging torrent. It plunged over a cliff, nearly 1.5 kilometers deep, creating the largest waterfall the Earth has ever known, 30 times taller than Niagara Falls. The sheer force of the water crashing downward was cataclysmic, sending shockwaves that triggered more earthquakes in the region. As the flood poured into the eastern basin, it not only reshaped the land, but also left behind massive deposits of sediment, which settled at the bottom of the newly refilled sea. The flood's power wasn't just in the volume of water, it was in the way it transformed everything it touched. From the surface, all signs of the cataclysm faded away. The Atlantic now flowed gently into the newly restored Mediterranean, its once turbulent waters calming to a peaceful, inviting expanse. The sea, now devoid of the massive cliffs and waterfalls, seemed serene, much like it would appear millions of years later when ancient civilizations like Greece and Rome rose along its shores. When the Greek poet Homer spoke of the legendary sea monsters Scylla and Charybdis, he described a mythic world full of perilous waters. Charybdis, often portrayed as a deadly whirlpool swallowing sailors whole, had no way of knowing that, in a sense, she had already been upstaged by the Mediterranean's own dramatic history. The sea had already seen a disaster far greater than any myth could imagine. It would take surprisingly long for any new sea creatures, monstrous or otherwise, to make a home in the Mediterranean. The waters, once so violently reshaped, needed time to settle and regain their balance. The ecosystem had to rebuild itself slowly, with the creatures that survived the flood, those few resilient species, acting as the seeds from which new life would eventually bloom. In geological terms, we should have been seeing marine fauna almost immediately, but that's not what happened, says Constantina Giatti, a geologist at the University of Vienna, who co-authored a paper on the impact of the salinity crisis and the flood on marine biodiversity. In the immediate aftermath of the megaflood, the waters of the Mediterranean were a harsh environment, far from the welcoming sea it would later become. The floodwaters, while vast, were devoid of nutrients and far too salty for most marine creatures to thrive. The few species that had survived the calamity struggled for millennia, clinging to existence in waters that were anything but hospitable. It wasn't until much later that the sea began to stabilize, becoming suitable for new life to return. Even today, the Mediterranean remains considerably saltier than the Atlantic, a legacy of the ancient flood that reshaped its very existence. It took a lot of time for the situation to settle enough for organisms coming from the Atlantic to actually establish healthy populations and grow, Giatti explained. Over millennia, the Mediterranean gradually transformed, and despite its salty waters, it became home to a rich and diverse range of marine life. Today, the sea is a biodiversity hotspot, teeming with all varieties of sea creatures, from vibrant fish to complex ecosystems. Even though the Zanclean megaflood happened millions of years ago, Aaron McAuliffe believes it still holds important clues about the future of our planet. As climate change accelerates, flooding caused by melting glaciers is becoming more common. By studying the dynamics of the Zanclean megaflood, which, despite being much larger than any glacial flood we've seen so far, scientists can gain valuable insights into what future flooding might look like. Understanding how such a vast amount of water moved and its effects on the surrounding landscape helps model the flow of water in future flood events, offering a glimpse of the challenges that lie ahead.